Hey, good evening. This is the last video for the EOC practice test. I want to cover questions 31 through 45. So starting with question 31, 31 and 32 both go with part 2 of this passage about food webs and looking at one native to Central Tennessee. So it's also on glucose transport, but talking about how energy is transferred within a food web. So you have a model of a food web. And remember, we have our primary producers, our primary consumers, secondary, and then tertiary consumers. And the arrow points to what is receiving the energy. And remember, it's about that 10% rule, about only 10% of energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So question 1 is asking which pyramid shows the correct model of energy transferred from the grass to the bobcat. So we're going from our producer here to one of our top carnivores here. And so the best model, remember, energy decreases as we move up a trophic level. And so the best model there is D. It shows producers having the most and energy decreasing as we go up the trophic level. So the correct answer there is D. Now, 32 is tricky. We do remember that 10% rule, and so you might automatically think that it needs to be 10%. However, you do need to do a couple of calculations. And so what you need to do for 32 is the leafhopper receives 463,000 kilojoules of energy. And then in the model from the leafhopper would be the deer mouse. And the deer mouse would only receive 46,300 kilojoules of energy. The gray rat snake would receive 4,630 kilojoules, and then the hawk would receive only 463. However, the question is asking specifically which value best represents the approximate energy lost between the gray rat snake and the Cooper's hawk. So you would actually subtract the 4,630 that the gray rat snake receives minus the 463 that the Cooper hawk will approximately receive. And when you subtract those two, you get 4,167, which B best represents that value at 4,170. So B is the correct answer there, because that's the difference, or the amount of energy lost between just those two species of the gray rat snake and the Cooper's hawk. Moving on to 33. 33 is a separate question. Notice we have genotypes there of the skin patches in the dog. So if it has a black patch, it's big E, little e. And if it has a white patch, it's recessive homozygous. And so here, we were looking for 3 statements that are true about the mutation that caused the black coloring. And the correct answer choices for 33 are B, C, E. Now, the reason it's B, C, E is if we look back up in the reading here, it says that the patches of color in the dog shown are caused by a somatic mutation. And remember, somatic cells are bodily cells. So the mutation does not occur in a gamete that can be passed on to offspring, then it happened in one of his bodily cells after fertilization. And so B, it will only affect this dog. It won't affect any of his offspring. C, it occurred after sperm and egg became together. And then E, it did make a permanent change to the DNA. So mutation changes DNA, and that mutation caused the different coloring in the dog. Moving on to 34, looking at enzymes, which we talked about a lot this semester. We see a reaction here, and we see its optimal reaction rate is around 40 degrees Celsius. So if the reaction temperature were to increase from 40 to 63, what would happen to the rate of the reaction? And obviously it would decrease. And remember, we talked about denaturing. The enzyme would lose its shape and it would no longer function. We can see up above 60, there's no rate of activity going on whatsoever. So the correct answer for 34 is A. Moving on to 35, we have a model of DNA going from 5' to 3' end here. So that's what these mean. This is a 5'. That little apostrophe there means prime. And then at the end of our strip here, we have a 3' end. And so strands run anti-parallel. So the complementary strand that would bond to this strand would run 3' to 5', kind of like a highway. One side runs north, the other side runs south. So we would want to find the correct sequence that would pair up, and we just think about Chargaff's base pairing rules, A with T and G with C. And so the correct answer there, we can eliminate B because it has U's, and we can eliminate D because it has U's. It would not be a copy, and that's what C is. So A would be the correct answer because it's a complementary strand of what is given in the model. 36 and 38, usually if we have time, we actually do a data nugget on this study about the silent crickets. And so you would read about this mutation that happened to crickets, that some crickets no longer make a chirping sound when they rub their legs together, and about the parasitic fly. And so the first question for this paragraph goes along with which graph best illustrates the fly and the cricket population changes that occurred in the years following the introduction of the flies. These flies are parasitic, and they were boring or burrowing into the crickets. And so the correct answer is actually A. So we can see when the flies were introduced, the cricket population decreased, and as when the parasitic flies were introduced, they increased because they were populating within the crickets. So the correct answer there is A. 37. Some of these are tricky. 37 is one of those. So you're trying to figure out the best explanation for the appearance of the flaunting phenotype among the crickets of the island in Hawaii. So remember, phenotype is physical appearance, and so I think you would narrow it down between A and D. A, I think, is a more obvious choice because you think that they themselves evolved the no chirping phenotype to escape the flies, but it's not as precise as D. So a mutation is really what caused the no chirping or the flaunting phenotype. So it would be D. 38. You are looking at crickets. Wild is just the normal type, the chirping. Flaunting would be your silent, and then there are female crickets, and then the flies. So you're looking at which is most likely correct, and the obvious answer is A. That population size will be larger in habitat 3 versus habitat 2. So habitat 3, they have the silent ones, and then they have female crickets. So it's okay that they have these parasitic flies because the female crickets are still going to be able to mate with the male crickets here because they're not dying off because of the parasitic flies. 2, however, they are going to be smaller in population size because the chirping male is present, but the flaunting or the silent male is absent. So that's going to be a smaller population size because the wild type is going to die off. So there's a part 2 to this along with silent crickets, and scientists noticed the same thing happening on another island of Oahu. And so it shows the initial year they observed the no chirping on each island, and then the frequency of alleles means how often the allele occurred within the population. So 0.96, the closer to 1, the higher the frequency. So 0.96 is pretty high. So looking at 39, I think you would maybe narrow it down between B and C. and then just C sounds more scientific. So males from each island have different genetic mutations affecting wing shape. So since they're on islands, Kauai, if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sure I'm not, and Oahu, they're islands, so they're not going to influence each other, and so they had separate mutations that occurred to those crickets, and so it'd be C. Going to 40, I think you would narrow it down between A and B. B seems like the more obvious answer because they were trying to avoid dying from those parasitic flies. However, the correct answer is A. Populations of crickets experience a high rate of mutation that produces many phenotypes. And so the mutation can, especially since it's over a short period of time, that would also relate to the high rate of mutation going along with that short period of time. So we're getting wild and we're getting flaunting as well. 41, the correct answer is B. So the wandering helps flaunting males find mates in the absence of chirping. And so the silent crickets wander around, and they have to in order to find a mate to be able to reproduce and pass that silence on to their offspring. Looking at 42, have cell division rates of humans or different cells in humans. And just reading the table, you would see that digestive, for the most part, has the fastest replacement rate. And so the correct answer is B. You could easily figure out that A, C, and D are incorrect by using the table. 43, good thing we just finished talking about meiosis. So advantages of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. And we talked about A a whole lot. Remember, meiosis has genetic diversity within gametes. And that meiosis is a form of sexual reproduction. And so we had crossing over, we have independent assortment. So those are going to lead to genetic variation that we don't see in asexual reproduction. 44 here, looking at cycling of matter. So going back to our biogeochemical cycles. And so the scientist is looking for a design that would match the goal of the researcher, which is experimenting with plants that will be grown under conditions that will limit the rate of photosynthesis. So think back to our photosynthesis equation. And so remember, our reactants are carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and our products are oxygen and glucose. And so the correct answer here is B. If we're going to limit carbon dioxide and then measure the rate of oxygen production, because that would tell us the rate of photosynthesis, since oxygen is a product of photosynthesis and carbon dioxide would be our independent variable here because it is a reactant of photosynthesis. And lastly, 45, very similar if you did that extra credit on this photosynthesis student inquiry. Now, one thing I will point out is that this x-axis here, one thing you would think near would be here and far would be over here, but it's not. They flipped it on you. So that's one thing you would want to make sure that you read the graph. And so we notice as the light gets nearer the plant, there's a higher rate of photosynthesis. So you're just figuring out which blank is correct. So it actually ends up being A. So let's see how that reads out. Based on the data represented in the graph, the rate of photosynthesis increases as the level of available light increases, which makes sense. As the light gets closer or near, we can see the curve of the rate of photosynthesis also increasing. The greatest change in the rate of photosynthesis occurs when the light level is low. So the correct answer is A. Then that completes the practice test. So I hope these videos are helpful, and we'll see you on Tuesday and next week.